We continue now our reading of History of the Reformation in the 16th Century by J.H. Murrell Daubigny. We are now moving on to Book Second, the second book. Chapter 1. Youth, Conversion, and First Labors of Luther. 1483 to 1517. Luther's descent, his parents, his birth, poverty, the paternal roof, strict discipline, first lessons, the school of Magdebourg, Wretchedness, Isenach, the Shunammite, the house of Cotta, the arts, remembrance of those times, his studies, Trebonius, the university. All was ready. God takes ages to prepare his work, but when the hour is come, accomplishes it by the feeblest instruments. To do great things by small means is the law of God. This law, which appears in every department of nature, is found also in history. God took the Reformation of the Church, where he had taken the apostles. He selected them from that humble class which, without containing the meanest of the people, is scarcely the length of citizenship. Everything must manifest to the world that the work is not of man, but of God. The reformer, Zuinglius, comes forth from the hut of a shepherd of the Alps, Melanchthon, the theologian of the Reformation, from the workshop of an armourer, and Luther from the cottage of a poor miner. The first stage in a man's life, that in which he is formed and moulded under the hand of God, is always important, and was so especially in the case of Luther. There, even at that period, the whole Reformation existed. The different phases of that great work succeeded each other in the soul of him who was the instrument of accomplishing it, before it was actually accomplished. The knowledge of the Reformation, which took place in Luther's heart, is the only key to the Reformation of the Church. We must study the particular work, if we would attain to a knowledge of the general work. Those who neglect the one will never know more than the form and exterior of the other. They may acquire a knowledge of certain events and certain results, but the intrinsic nature of the revival they cannot know, because the living principle which formed the soul of it is hidden from them. Let us then study the Reformation in Luther, before studying it in events which changed the face of Christendom. In the village of Mora, towards the forests of Thuringia, and not far from the spot where Boniface, the apostle of Germany, began to proclaim the gospel, there existed, and undoubtedly had existed for ages, an ancient and numerous family of the name of Luther. The eldest son, as usual was the peasantry of Thuringia, always succeeded to the house and the paternal plot, while the younger members of the family set out in quest of a livelihood. John Luther, having married Margaret Lindemann, daughter of an inhabitant of Neustadt, in the bishopric of Wurzburg, the married couple removed from the plains of Isenach and fixed their residence in the little town of Eisleben, in Saxony, in order to gain their bread by the sweat of their brow. Seckendorf relates on the testimony of Robin, superintendent of Isenach in 1601, that Luther's mother, thinking she was still far from her time, had gone to the fair of Eisleben, and there, unexpectedly, gave birth to a son. Notwithstanding of the credit due to such a man as Seckendorf, this account appears not to be correct. In fact, none of the older biographers of Luther make any mention of it. Besides, Mora is more than 24 leagues distant from Eisleben, and persons in the circumstances in which Luther's mother then was seldom are disposed to take such long journeys to go to the fair. In fine, the account seems quite at variance with Luther's own statement. John Luther was an upright, straightforward, hard-working man, with a firmness of character bordering on obstinacy. Of a more cultivated mind than usual with persons of his class, he was a great reader. Books were then rare, but he never let pass any opportunity of procuring them. They were his relaxation in the intervals of repose from hard and long-continued labor. Margaret possessed the virtues which adorn honest and pious women. She was remarked in particular for her modesty, her fear of God, and her spirit of prayer. The mothers of the place regarded her as a model whom they ought to imitate. It is not exactly known how long this couple had been fixed at Eisleben, when, on the 10th November, an hour before midnight, Margaret gave birth to his son. Melanchthon often questioned the mother of his friend as to the period of his birth. "I remember the day and the hour very well," would she reply, "but for the year I am not certain of it." Luther's brother James, an honest and upright man, has stated that in the opinion of all the family, Martin was born in the year of Christ, 1483, on the 10th November, being St. Martin's Eve. The first thought of the pious parents was to take the infant which God had given them, and dedicate it to God in holy baptism. On the following day, which happened to be a Tuesday, the father, with gratitude and joy, carried his son to St. Peter's Church, where he received the seal of his dedication to the Lord. He was named Martin in honor of the day. Young Martin was not 6 months old when his parents quitted Eisleben for Mansfeld, which is only 5 leagues distant. The mines of Mansfeld were then much famed, and John Luther, a laboring man, feeling that he might perhaps be called to rear a numerous family, hoped he might there more easily gain a livelihood. It was in this town that the intellect and powers of young Luther received their first development. Here his activity began to be displayed, and his disposition to be manifested by what he said and what he did. The plains of Mansfeld, the banks of the Wipper, were the scenes of his first sports with his playmates. The commencement of their residence at Mansfeld was attended with painful privations to honest John and his wife, for they lived some time in great poverty. "My parents," says the Reformer, "were very poor. My father was a poor woodcutter, and my mother often carried his wood on her back to procure subsistence for us children. The toil they endured for us was severe, even to blood. The example of parents whom he respected, and the habits in which they trained him, early accustomed Luther to exertion and frugality. Often, doubtless, he accompanied his mother to the wood, and made up his little faggot also. Promises are given to the just man's labor, and John Luther experienced the reality of them. Having become somewhat more easy in his circumstances, he established 2 smelting furnaces at Mansfeld. Around these furnaces young Martin grew up, and the return which they yielded enabled his father, at a later period, to provide for his studies. The spiritual founder of Christendom, says Worsley Mathesius, was to come forth from a family of miners, an image of what God purposed when he employed him to cleanse the sons of Levi, and purify them in his furnaces like gold. Universally respected for his integrity, his blameless life, and good sense, John Luther was made a councillor of Mansfeld, the capital of the county of that name. Too great wretchedness might have weighed down the spirit of the child, but the easy circumstances of the paternal roof expanded his heart, and elevated his character. John availed himself of his new situation to cultivate the society which he preferred. He set great value on educated men, and often invited the clergymen and teachers of the place to his table. His house presented an example of one of those societies of simple citizens which did honor to Germany at the commencement of the 16th century, and as a mirror reflected the numerous images which succeeded each other on the troubled stage of that time. It was not lost on the child. The sight of men to whom so much respect was shown in his father's house must, doubtless, on more than one occasion, have awakened in young Martin's heart an ambitious desire one day to become a schoolmaster or a man of learning. As soon as he was of an age to receive some instruction, his parents sought to give him the knowledge and inspire him with the fear of God, and train him in Christian virtues. Their utmost care was devoted to his primary domestic education. This, however, was not the sole object of their tender solicitude. His father, desirous of seeing him acquire the elements of knowledge for which he himself had so much esteem, invoked the divine blessing on his head, and sent him to school. As Martin was still a very little boy, his father, or Nicholas Emler, a young man of Mansfeld, often carried him in their arms to the house of George Emilius, and went again to fetch him. Emler afterwards married one of Luther's sisters. The piety of the parents, their activity, and strict virtue gave a happy impulse to the boy, making him of a grave and attentive spirit. The system of education which then prevailed employed fear and punishment as its leading stimulants. Margaret, though sometimes approving the too strict discipline of her husband, often opened her maternal arms to Martin to console him in his tears. She herself occasionally carried to excess that precept of divine wisdom, which says, "He that spareth the rod hateth his son." The impetuous temper of the child often led to frequent reproof and correction. "My parents," says Luther in after life, "treated me harshly, and made me very timid. My mother one day chastised me about a filbert till the blood came. They believed with all their heart they were doing right, but they could not discriminate between dispositions, though this is necessary in order to know when and how punishments should be inflicted. The poor child's treatment at school was not less severe. His master one morning beat him 15 times in succession. "It is necessary," said Luther when mentioning the fact, "it is necessary to chastise children, but it is necessary at the same time to love them." With such an education, Luther early learned to despise the allurements of a sensual life. "He who is to become great must begin with little," justly remarks one of his earliest biographers. "And if children are brought up with too much delicacy and tenderness, it does them harm all the rest of their life." Martin learned something at school. He was taught the heads of the Catechism, the 10 Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, hymns, forms of prayer, and the Donat. This last was a Latin grammar, composed in the 4th century by Donatus, St. Jerome's master, and having been improved in the 11th century by a French monk named Remigius, was long in high repute as a schoolbook. He moreover conned the Sissio Janus, a very singular almanac, composed in the 10th or 11th century. In short, he learned all that was taught in the Latin school of Mansfeld. But the child seems not to have been brought to God. The only religious sentiment which could be discovered in him was that of fear. Whenever he heard Jesus Christ mentioned, he grew pale with terror, for the Saviour had been represented to him as an angry judge. This servile fear, so foreign to genuine religion, perhaps predisposed him for the glad tidings of the gospel, and for the joy which he afterwards experienced when he became acquainted with him who is meek and lowly in heart. John Luther longed to make his son a learned man. The new light, which began to radiate in all directions, penetrated even the cottage of the miner of Mansfield, and there awakened ambitious thoughts. The remarkable disposition and persevering application of his son inspired John with the most brilliant hopes. Accordingly, in 1497, when Martin had completed his 14th year, his father resolved to part with him, and send him to a school of the Franciscans at Magdebourg. Margaret behoved, of course, to consent, and Martin prepared to quit the paternal roof. Magdebourg was like a new world to Martin. Amid numerous privations, for he had scarcely the means of subsistence, he read and attended lectures. André Prelise, provincial of the Augustine order, was then preaching with great fervor on the necessity of reforming religion and the Church. He, however, was not the person who deposited in the young man's soul the first germ of those ideas which afterward expanded in it. This period was a kind of severe apprenticeship to Luther. Launched upon the world at 14, without friend or patron, he trembled in presence of his masters, and during the hours of recreation painfully begged his food with children as poor as himself. "I and my comrades," says he, "begged a little food for our subsistence. One day, at the season when the Church celebrates the birth of Jesus Christ, we were in a body scouring the neighboring villages, going from house to house, and in 4 parts singing the ordinary hymns on the babe at Bethlehem. We stopped before a peasant's cottage, which stood by itself at the extremity of a village. The peasant, hearing us singing our Christmas carols, came out with some provisions which he meant to give us, and asked, in a gruff voice and a harsh tone, "Where are you, boys?" His tones frightened us, and we took to our heels. We had no cause for fear, for the peasant was sincere in his offer of assistance. But our hearts were, no doubt, made timid by the menaces and tyranny with which masters at this period oppressed their scholars. Hence the sudden fright which seized us. At last, however, the peasant still continuing to call us, we stopped, laid aside our fear, and running up to him, received the food which he intended for us. In the same way, adds Luther, are we wont to tremble and flee when our conscience is guilty and alarmed. Then we are afraid even of the assistance which is offered to us, and to those who are friendly to us, and would do us all sorts of kindness. A year had scarcely passed when John and Margaret, on being made aware of the difficulties which their son had in living in Magdebourg, sent him to Isenach, where there was a celebrated school, and they had a number of relations. They had other children, and, though their circumstances had improved, they were unable to maintain their son in a strange town. The forges and late hours of John Luther did no more than keep the family at Mansfield. It was hoped that Martin would find a livelihood more easily at Isenach, but he was not more successful. His relations in the town did not trouble themselves about him. Perhaps their own poverty made them unable to give him any assistance. When the scholar felt the gnawings of hunger, he had no resource but to do as at Magdebourg, to join his fellow students and sing with them before the houses for a morsel of bread. This custom of the time of Luther has been preserved, even to our day, in several towns of Germany, where the voices of the boys sometimes produce a most harmonious chant. Instead of bread, poor modest Martin often received only hard words. Then, overcome with sadness, he shed many tears in secret, unable to think of the future without trembling. One day, in particular, he had been repulsed from 3 houses, and was preparing, without having broken his fast, to return to his lodging, when, on arriving at St. George's Square, he halted, and, absorbed in gloomy thoughts, stood motionless before the house of an honest burgher. Will it be necessary, from want of bread, to give up study, and go and work with his father in the mines of Mansfeld? Suddenly a door opens, and a female is seen on the threshold. It was the wife of Conrad Cotta, the daughter of the burgomaster of Illefeld. Her name was Ursula. The chronicles of Isenach call her the pious Shunammite, in allusion to her who so earnestly pressed the prophet Elisha to eat bread with her. Previous to this, the Christian Shunammite had more than once observed young Martin in the assemblies of the faithful, and been touched by the sweetness of his voice and his devout behavior. She had just heard the harsh language addressed to the poor scholar, and seeing him in sadness before her door, she came to his assistance, beckoned him to enter, and set food before him to appease his hunger. Conrad approved of the benevolence of his wife, and was even so much pleased with the society of young Luther that some days after he took him home to his house. From this moment his studies were secure. He will not be obliged to return to the mines of Mansfeld, and bury the talent with which God has entrusted him. When he no longer knew what was to become of him, God opened to him the heart and the home of a Christian family. This event helped to give him that confidence in God which in after life the strongest tempests could not shake. In the house of Cotta, Luther was introduced to a mode of life very different from that which he had hitherto known. He there led an easy existence, exempt from want and care. His mind became more serene, his disposition more lively, and his heart more open. His whole being expanded to the mild rays of charity, and began to beat with life, joy, and happiness. His prayers were more ardent, and his thirst for knowledge more intense. He made rapid progress. To literature and science he added the charms of art. Those who are designed by God to act upon their contemporaries are themselves, in the first instance, seized and carried along by all the tendencies of their age. Luther learned to play on the flute and the lute. The latter instrument he often accompanied with his fine countervoice, thus enlivening his heart in moments of sadness. He took pleasure also in employing his notes to testify his gratitude to his adopted mother, who was very fond of music. His own love of it continued to old age, and both the words and the music of some of the finest anthems which Germany possesses are his composition. Some have even been translated into our language. Happy time for the young man! Luther always remembered it with emotion. Many years after, a son of Conrad, having come to study at Wittenberg, when the poor scholar of Isenach had become the doctor of his age, he gladly received him at his table and under his roof. He wished to pay back to the son part of what he had received from the parents. It was while thinking of the Christian woman who gave him food when all besides repulsed him, that he gave utterance to this fine expression: Earth has nothing gentler than the female heart in which piety dwells. Luther was never ashamed of the days when, pressed by hunger, he was under the necessity of begging for his studies and his maintenance. So far from this, he, on the contrary, reflected with gratitude on the great poverty of his use. He regarded it as one of the means which God had employed to make him what he afterwards became, and he felt thankful for it. The poor youths who were obliged to follow the same course touched his heart. "Do not," said he, "despise the boys who sing before your houses, and ask, panem propter Deum, bread for the love of God. I have done it myself. It is true that, at a later period, my father, with great love and kindness, kept me at the University of Erfurt, maintaining me by the sweat of his brow. Still I once was a poor beggar. And now, by means of my pen, I am come thus far, that I would not change situations with the Grand Turk himself. Nay, more were all the goods of the world piled up one above another, I would not take them in exchange for what I have. And yet I should not be where I am, if I had not been at school, and learned to write. Thus, in these first humble beginnings, this great man traced the origin of his fame. He fears not to remind us that the voice whose accents made the empire and the world to tremble had once begged a morsel of bread in the streets of a poor city. The Christian takes pleasure in such recollections, as reminding him that it is in God he must glory. The strength of his intellect and the liveliness of his imagination soon enabled him to outstrip all his fellow students. His progress was particularly rapid in ancient languages, eloquence, and poetry. He wrote essays and made verses, lively, complacent, and what is called good-hearted. He was a great favorite with his masters and his comrades. Among the professors, he attached himself particularly to John Trebonius, a learned man of pleasing manners, who showed youth those attentions which are so well fitted to encourage them. Martin had remarked that when Trebonius entered the class, he took off his hats and bowed to the students. Great condescension in those pedantic times! This had pleased the young man, and made him feel that he was not a mere cipher. The respect of the master had made the pupil rise in his own estimation. The colleagues of Trebonius, who had not the same custom of taking off their hats, having one day expressed their astonishment at his extreme condescension, he replied, and the reply made no less impression on young Lucer, "Among these youths are men whom God will one day make burgomasters, chancellors, doctors, and magistrates. And though you do not yet see them with their badges of office, it is right, however, to show them respect." No doubt, the young student listened with pleasure to these words, and even then, perhaps saw himself with a doctor's cap on his head.